Uh, Here we are, picking our way through the treasure trove that is Ephesians chapter 1. It's a bit like Aladdin's Cave of Wonders. We're looking at all the jewels along the way. Well, we've reached another one, and it's reflected in verses 12 and 13, where Paul is talking about the fact that they had come to hope in Christ. And then in verse 13, he says, "And you also were included in Christ when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation." It's quite an amazing phrase, really. I think he's making the point from his particularly Jewish perspective. He writes as a Jewish man brought up with the understanding that he was part of the covenant people of God, God's family. But what's happened now is that others have been invited in, outsiders have been brought in. And that's why he says, you also, we as Jewish believers, we were the ones first to hear of Christ. Of course, Jesus was Jewish. And yet now you Ephesian Gentiles, pagans, have been brought in by believing in Jesus. Perhaps we don't appreciate how huge the barrier was at the time between Jew and Gentile. We don't feel how radical it is for Paul to be writing like this. But in actual fact, we don't have to look all that far ourselves to think that it's quite natural for us to make those sorts of barriers that exist. Building walls to keep people out, it comes quite naturally to us. Demonizing people from other nations or communities is easy for us. We blame them for our problems, we push them away, we exclude them, we say, this is our club, you don't belong. This is our country, we don't want you. It's quite easy for us. But Paul says, you also were included. What is it that makes that possible for him to say that? Well, it's the gospel of Jesus. You were included when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation. It's the good news of Jesus that does this. And he's going to have more to say about it in chapter 2. We may actually reach that if lockdown and restrictions continue. But in chapter 2 and 3, you'll see that he says more about this. But it's the good news of Jesus that does this, just to note that here. It's in Jesus that we're reconciled because we're reconciled to God through him. We have peace with each other because we have peace with God, first of all. It's in him. And I think we should note it is in believing in him. It's not in adopting some religious practice or any other practice for that matter. It's in trusting in Jesus and being brought together in him. Of course, churches don't express this perfectly. We're not very good sometimes, perhaps quite often, at including others. We can have our clubs and our cliques that restrict others or keep them out or just make them feel unwelcome. That's quite possible. But if churches are like that, then they're acting out of line with what they are, with what their DNA actually is. They're not fitting in with what they actually are in Christ. The you also is part of God's plan for the healing of the world through Jesus. The you also is the message for the world. We don't stand aloof behind our walls. We reach out. Well, actually, more importantly, we go out to seek to bring others in. And maybe that should be encouragement to you as well, or perhaps I should say to you also. Maybe you've always felt a bit of a loner or an outsider. You're not included. Well, here's a statement that says you are included. You come to Jesus alongside everybody else. We meet together at the foot of the cross. We're brought together in him. So the welcome is open to you also to be part of his family. And if you have discovered that, perhaps you have discovered it as a reality that you are part of God's family, don't forget that you also is the DNA of the Christian message. And so you need to ask, even in these difficult, restricted lockdown times, what am I doing to say to others, well, you also can know this? One thing you could do is share this. Share what you see is the motto, isn't it? You could share this and pass it on to your friends and say, this is what I've been watching. Would you like to know more about it yourself? Well, I'll leave you to ponder on that. and I'll see you also tomorrow.